Typhoid Mary goes down as one of the more undesirable characters in American history. Her real name wasn't actually Typhoid Mary, believe it or not, it was Mary Mallon. Mallon was born in Ireland on September 23, 1869. In 1884, at the age of 15, she immigrated to the States, where she would begin to earn a living as a cook. Mallon's efforts would prove successful. Before long, Mallon was cooking for a living and her future in the land of opportunity was looking bright. This would be short-lived, however. Little did Mallon yet know, but there was a minor problem with the particular path she had chosen to pursue. Just as her career would start to pick up, an epidemic of typhoid fever would continue to spread among the greater New York area. Important to note is that, back then, typhoid fever was a pretty big deal. Think of it more like the COVID of the olden era. In modern times, with our antibiotics and our fancy vaccines, typhoid fever no longer poses much of a risk, namely to those in developed nations, but in the days of Mary Mallon, it was an epidemic, it was scary, and it was a problem. Because one more thing I forgot to mention, for about 10 to 20% of those who would become infected, it was also deadly. Typhoid fever, or just typhoid, spreads to humans via the bacteria called Salmonella. You may have heard of it before. Salmonella is a highly contagious bacteria, which can be spread through close contact, and through contaminated food and drink. Foods most susceptible to Salmonella contamination include meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and dairy products, but the bacteria can still survive in other foods as well, not limited to fruits, vegetables, and so on. Symptoms of typhoid fever mainly include fever, as the name would suggest, nausea, diarrhea, headache, belly aches and various digestive issues. In severe cases, it's said that some would also develop bright red sores on or near their abdomen. Besides sounding like an unpleasant thing to have to endure, the big deal was that in the early 1900s, if a person came down with typhoid, they couldn't just pop a few horse pills and be all better. Antibiotics wouldn't roll around until the 1940s, and a preliminary vaccine would not be introduced until 1911. Thus, for many of those who showed positive for the illness, the prognosis could often be fatal. So what does this have to do with our old friend Mary Mallon anyway? Well, as it would turn out, Miss Mallon was special. But probably not in the ways her parents had hoped. You see, unfortunately for Mallon, whose work as a cook should have come to an abrupt end upon news of her predicament, her claim to fame would not be the act of becoming a world-renowned chef to the stars. Rather, Mary Mallon would soon be identified as the very first asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. Also known as a healthy carrier, an asymptomatic carrier, like Mary Mallon, could, and did technically carry this highly contagious disease, but she herself would never develop any symptoms of her own. This would prove itself a double-edged sword. Typhoid Mary, as she soon became better known, would prove herself a stealthy villain. And especially when her actions are looked upon in isolation, void of context or clarification about certain social and cultural issues of those times, it's easy to see how her choices might have easily been interpreted as sheer evil. The problem most people have is the knowledge that although Mallon knew of her predicament as a carrier, but she didn't appear much to care one iota, as evidenced in her continuing to take cooking job after cooking job, whilst leaving a trail of infected individuals in her path. Some scholars have come to argue that Mallon in fact was rather oblivious to her state, that nobody had bothered to explain to her what it meant to be a carrier. Even some of Mary's own writing seems to point to the notion that she didn't exactly grasp how it was possible for a person to carry a disease for which they themselves showed no symptoms. Unfortunately, this, what Mallon actually knew or didn't know, which might serve to villainize Mallon depending on the outcome, will likely never be known for certain. What we have been able to observe is that time and time again, even as well-to-do consumers of Retainen meals would start to fall sick from the illness en masse, Mallon ignored this and continued to work her way feverishly up the social culinary ladder, steadily amassing an increasingly more wealthy, and hence more generous clientele. During this time spent as a chef, while serving up her salmonella-stained entrees, Mallon passed the disease on to countless of unsuspecting patrons. While some of the more generous accounts cap her infection count at about 50, and state her kill count at 3, Others have speculated that especially due to her use of aliases at various places of work she may have more accurately infected between 51 and 122 individuals, and of course, killing an unknown number that reached above the modest figure typically attributed to her. Also quite suspect is the way that she would nonchalantly skip from job to job, simply changing her surname, and for long periods of time, no one would be the wiser. But as is so often the case, Malin's brazen bird stuffing, and the audacity of her bold, boisterous bun baking, would all come to catch up with her before long. In 1909, Malin would sue the health department, but her complaint would be thrown out. Normally, this might have meant a life sentence for Malin, were it not for the New York State Commissioner of Health, who took pity on Malin at last, in just the following year. In 1910, after being in quarantine for 2 years and 11 months, Malin was again free to walk. Except there was just one small stipulation. Malin would be free to go as long as she adhered to one strict promise, that she never set foot around another person's food again. More accurately, she was forbade from working as a cook, or anything that would require her coming into contact with people's food. To abide by this, Malin gave her word. She agreed she would pursue work as what they called the domestic, but never again as a cook. Once she was freed, authorities managed to keep tabs on her whereabouts for a while before they lost track of her and Malin went back to cooking again. And not surprisingly, a familiar old pattern would re-emerge as Typhoid Mary left a wake of bloated, nauseous, feverish patrons in her path. Even so, it was for nearly 5 years that Malin, dubbed the most dangerous woman in America, would manage to evade authorities. Then at last, in 1915, perhaps the inevitable happened. In 1915, an outbreak of typhoid fever at the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan, which made 25 workers sick and claimed 2 lives, was successfully traced back to the hospital cook, a woman who worked under the name of Mary Brown, and the nickname Typhoid Mary. After that, it was, perhaps, just a matter of putting 2 and 2 together. That same year, Typhoid Mary Malin would be apprehended for the last time. This time, authorities vowed, Malin would not live to see another stove again except for her own. They shipped her back to North Brother Island, where she would remain for the next 30 years, it was there on that island that Malin would live until she eventually would take her final breath. 6 years prior to her death on November 11, 1938, Malin suffered a debilitating stroke which left her paralyzed and completely helpless until the day she succumbed to pneumonia. In the end, the woman known as Typhoid Mary could not have been a more tragic figure had she been a product of Shakespeare's imagination. It is said that the last 3 decades of her life were spent in the utmost misery, not because of any physical pain, but due to the pain of living in the shadow of complete isolation from other human beings, her day-to-day existence void of all meaningful human interaction. Except as hard as it had been for Malin to garner any sympathy the first time around, this time it would prove impossible. Many believe that Malin brought the punishment all unto herself. While Malin was certainly not, by the end of the outbreak, the only asymptomatic carrier to walk the streets of New York freely, it was her violation of the rules imposed on her that made the world see her punishment as necessary. As was written in the New York Tribune, most seem to be of the following opinion: the chance was given to her 5 years ago to live in freedom, but she deliberately elected to throw it away. Most people seem to be in agreement. The 1909 letter to her lawyer reflects the desperation of a person who genuinely feels they're the picture of perfect health and being held for virtually no reason. She herself talks of the fact that the doctors, who she doesn't seem to hold in very high esteem, seem to have no clue about her condition any more than she does. As she laments, at first they told her that the bacteria was in her intestines, then in her bowels, and now in her gallbladder, which they were constantly threatening to remove. What's more, she argued, a quarter of her stool samples, taken at the island, during her stay there had come up negative. And on top of that, the samples she had sent to an independent lab outside the facility, with the help of a friend of course, had each come up negative as well. There is a high likelihood that, Malin, honest to God, did not believe she was infecting anybody. Now, whether she should have is a whole different question, but it's a question I think we should more aptly be asking ourselves. Was it due to sheer pig-headedness on her part that Mary refused to understand what it meant to be a carrier, or was it the result of not having been educated about it by anyone? On second hand, one might pose a third argument even. Which is, why should Mary Mallon not have been sheerly pig-headed after all? Identified as Typhoid Mary, the woman responsible for the numerous typhoid outbreaks she was known for leaving in her wake, once apprehended, Miss Mallon would stand trial and be found guilty, then sentenced into quarantine. This sentence would be carried out at a hospital at North Brother Island, where it said she lived in a small cottage, and she would lament about how her only companion, for many years, was her dog, a species, by the way, that's immune to catching salmonella. This was but the first of 2 times Miss Mallon would be forced into quarantine as a result of her refusal to remain away from working in public kitchens. This stint would last from 1907 to 1910, or approximately 3 whole years. Perhaps nothing tells of Mallon's reaction to her sentencing more than a well-circulated photo of a grumpy-looking Mary Mallon taken as she lies, begrudgingly, in a hospital bed. Suffice it to say, Mallon was not happy, and any hint of displeasure the photo seems to pick up on was in probability very real. In 1909, after being in quarantine for over 2 years, Mallon would pen an impassioned letter that eventually would be made out to her own lawyer. This 6-page letter may be the first time we get a glimpse into Mallon's mind, into how she feels about her own condition, her incarceration away from humanity, and the deplorable way in which she feels she had been treated. Readers can't also help but get the gist that Mallon seems to have very little insight to her own condition, and it even might in some ways corroborate what some critics have claimed. That is, that nobody ever bothered to explain to Mary Mallon what it meant to be a carrier, and that she continued to remain confused as to how a person could spread a disease which they showed no symptoms of themselves. Of course, there is always the other faction that may argue that actions speak louder than words. When facing trial, authorities had pointed to the fact that Mallon had merely snubbed her nose at orders not to cook, and some would even surmise, at properly washing her hands, hence their final decision that she was a woman too dangerous to be left to her own devices while living freely amongst the community. As an aside, it would later be supposed that Mallon may have spread her deadly germs to her mostly affluent clients through the serving of her signature dessert, a purportedly delicious ice cream of sorts, which of course could not be cooked, hence giving the germs free rein over victims' bodies as they deceptively suckled and tantalized their taste buds, even if, say, Mallon had indeed engaged in a rigorous regime of hand scrubbing. Regardless, the fact would remain that despite her attempts to reach out, nobody seemed to be on her side. It's rumored that Mallon was born with typhoid, due to her mother having been infected with the disease upon giving birth to Mary. Throughout her life, albeit through no fault of her own, Mallon had lived with the ridicule that came along with simply being herself. The independent investigator, George Soper, had been hired by one of Mallon's wealthy clients to uncover what or who had been the source of the typhoid outbreak affecting their home. When it said that Mallon refused to cooperate, and that she had even become downright hostile, Soper had taken to conducting an investigation into the last 5 years of Mallon's history. He was ultimately in disbelief at what he uncovered, the string of bodies left in her wake, so to speak, that he even published Mallon's identity, alongside all of his findings, in the newspaper. It could be said that this was the moment that Typhoid Mary was born. Word of her existence simply spread like wildfire from that point on. After then, numerous publications would seem to revel in bad-mouthing and poking fun at Mary Mallon. In one publication, one writer wondered aloud whether Mallon might in fact be a witch. And certainly, New Yorkers couldn't seem to get enough of the character they came to know, but also fear, as Typhoid Mary. This being born of fear, the public ultimately viewed Mallon with the utmost of disdain. The only problem with this, of course, is that Typhoid Mary wasn't a character. She was a real human being, even beneath any hostility she may have displayed. Even if Mallon had been an abrasive, opinionated, and so-called uncooperative woman, did this entitle her to a whole lifetime of ridicule, capped off by her final 20-some years sentence to near total isolation? As we start to bring this story to a close, I think it's important that everyone remember a couple of things. Things in the early 1900s, that is, over 100 years ago, were very different than they are today. Nowadays, if you're a woman and you're unemployed, it's not a preposterous idea to conceive of seeing a now hiring sign in any random shop window, and going in to ask for an application or hand them your resume. It's not a common occurrence for you to be laughed at or to surmise that your gender precludes or prohibits you from working in a certain field. There still exist sectors that remain predominated by one or the other gender, but by comparison to how things were at the beginning of the 20th century, things are radically different. In the times of Mary Mallon, there were very strict social rules in place governing the types of jobs, or roles, appropriate for women. A help wanted sign didn't mean just anyone could be considered qualified for the slot they hoped to fill. Women could cook, they could clean, or do domestic work, but beyond just a few things like these, women were substantially limited. Not only did the role have to be deemed a role suitable to women, but on top of that, she would have needed to be experienced and trained. So, when Mary Mallon was set free onto the streets of New York City and she was sworn never to seek out work as a cook, which in Mallon's case was her only area of expertise, where was she supposed to go? What was it anticipated she would do? When released from her first time in quarantine, she had vowed to seek out work in a domestic field rather than in a kitchen. However, as it turned out, the department that had made her promise she would do this, actually neglected to fulfill their own end of the bargain by providing Mallon with training in any other line of work. What goes to prove that they knew this was problematic, and that training would be critical to her ability to land another job and in a different line of work, is the glaring and undeniable fact that the superintendent was in fact later reprimanded for failing to provide her with any said training. So, quickly just put yourself in Mallon's shoes where you find yourself in a scenario where you've got to put a roof over your head, you need money for your own room and board and clothing and utilities and basic expenses, and you don't have a husband to take care of all of these things for you, nor should you be required to expect or want such a thing for that matter. And just in the most practical sense of KTR, what are you supposed to do? I don't know if Mallon evaded the authorities deliberately during that first year of freedom or else that they simply just lost track of her whereabouts, but at that point, where they do lose track, what was Miss Mallon expected to do to keep a roof over her head? It isn't as if getting herself her own education would be an option for her in her position, in those times, either. Take this coupled with the probable belief that you don't even believe that you're making other people sick, and it's at least possible that her re-entry into the food service industry was far less malicious than history has led us to believe her intentions to be. In the end, there's a lot to this story. A lot more than we've been able to touch on here. I think in conclusion, if you're interested in learning more, it's definitely encouraged for you to do some more research. With that said, I hope you enjoyed our little peek into the fascinating and at times disturbing and troubled life of Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary. In the end, what are your thoughts? Was Mallon a victim or a villain? Was a lifelong sentence truly the best answer? Sound off on any aspect down below. Also please don't forget to like and subscribe. That concludes this episode. I can't wait to see you back next time. Ciao!